Dracula, Chapter 12. Dr. Seward's diary continued. September 18th. I drove immediately to the Westenra's house. I knocked as softly as I could, hoping not to disturb Lucy or her mother. When no one answered, I knocked and rang more loudly. I cursed the laziness of the servants for still sleeping at this hour, for it was almost 10 o'clock. As I continued knocking, however, a terrible fear came over me. Was I too late? I went around the house, searching for an open door or window, but everything was locked. As I did so, I heard the pit-pat of horses' feet, and Van Helsing appeared out of breath. "How is she?" he gasped. "Are we in time? Didn't you get my telegram?" I explained everything as quickly as I could. His face turned pale as he said, "Then I fear we are too late. But come, we must find a way in." We went around to the back of the house, where there was a wood kitchen window. The professor took a small surgical saw from his case, and I managed to cut through the iron bars which guarded it. We pushed back the lock with the handle of a long, thin knife and crawled inside. There was no one in the kitchen or in the servants' rooms, but in the dining room we found 4 servant women lying on the floor. We could hear their loud snores and smell the odor of the narcotic, so we realized they were drugged. "We will help them later," Van Helsing said. Then we climbed the stairs to Lucy's room. We listened for an instant or two at the door, but there was no sound. With white faces and trembling hands, we opened the door gently and went into the room. And oh, the awful sight that met our eyes! Broken glass littered the floor, and the breeze came freely through a shattered window. On the bed lay 2 women, Lucy and her mother. Mrs. Westenra was covered with a white sheet, the edge of which had blown back to show the look of terror on her cold, dead face. By her side lay Lucy. Her wreath of flowers was missing from her neck, and the 2 little wounds on her neck were horribly white and ragged. Without a word, the professor bent over the bed, listening for Lucy's heartbeat. Leaping to his feet, he cried out to me, "It's not yet too late. Quick, quick, bring the brandy." I ran downstairs and returned with it, being careful to smell and taste it in case it too was drugged. The maids were beginning to mutter and moan in their sleep. As he had done once before, Van Helsing rubbed the brandy onto Lucy's lips and gums, and on her wrists and the palms of her hands. He said to me, "I can do this alone. Go, wake the maids. Tell them to make a fire and prepare a hot bath. This poor soul is nearly as cold as her mother. She needs to be warmed before we can do anything." The maids were dazed at first. Then they began to cry hysterically as they remembered what they had seen. I scolded them, telling them that it was too late to save Mrs. Westenra, but they still had time to help Lucy. So they went sobbing on their way to heat water for a bath. Once Lucy was in it, one of the maids hurried in, whispering that there was a gentleman at the door with a message from Mr. Holmwood. I told her we could not see anyone now and promptly forgot all about it. The heat was beginning to have some effect on Lucy. Her heart beat a little more strongly, and her breathing steadied a bit. Van Helsing's face almost beamed as we lifted her from the bath and rolled her in a warm towel to dry her. We took Lucy into another room, put her in bed, and forced a few drops of brandy down her throat. I noticed that Van Helsing has tied a soft silk handkerchief around her throat. She was still unconscious, and she looked worse than we had ever seen her. Van Helsing called in one of the women and told her to not take her eyes off her until we returned, and then led me out of the room. "We must think what to do," he said as we went downstairs. "Where can we get help? We must have another transfusion of blood, and soon, or that poor girl will die. You and I are exhausted. I don't trust these panicky maids. Who can help us now?" "What's the matter with me?" the voice came from the sofa across the room. The sound brought joy to my heart, for it was Quincy Morris. "Quincy, what brought you here?" I cried, taking his hand. "This did," he said, handing me a telegram. It was from Arthur, and it read, "Have not heard from Seward for 3 days, and am terribly anxious. Cannot leave. Father still very ill. Send me news how Lucy is. Do not delay. Holmwood." "I think I came just in the nick of time. Just tell me what to do," said Quincy. Van Helsing came forward and took his hand, looking him straight in the eyes. "The devil may work against us, but God sends us good men when we need them," he said. And once again, we went through the transfusion. I don't have the heart to describe it. Lucy was weaker than ever before, and although plenty of blood went into her veins, her body barely responded. Finally, though, her heart and lungs were working a little more strongly, and I sent Quincy downstairs to eat and rest. When I returned to the bedroom, I found Van Helsing reading a sheet of paper. He handed it to me, saying only, "It dropped from Lucy's pocket when we carried her to the bath." When I had read it, I asked the professor, "In God's name, what does it all mean? Is she mad? Or what sort of terrible danger is it?" Van Helsing took the paper, saying, "Don't worry about it now. You will understand it all in good time." Next, I hurried out to notify the undertaker of Mrs. Westenra's death. The poor lady's heart disease was enough explanation. I did not feel it was necessary to reveal what had caused her final shock. When I returned, I met Quincy, who was putting together a telegram for Arthur, telling that Mrs. Westenra has died. "Jack, may I have a word with you?" Quincy asked. We sat down to talk. "I don't want to push myself in where I don't belong, but this is no ordinary case. You know I love that girl and wanted to marry her, and though that's done and over, I can't help worrying about her. Just what is it that is wrong with her? That fine old Dutchman of yours said that she must have another transfusion of blood, and that both you and he were exhausted, didn't he?" "He did," I said, and he went on. "Then I take it that you and Van Helsing have both done already what I did today?" "That's right." "And I guess Art has too? When I saw him 4 days ago, he looked awful. I have not seen anyone get run down so quickly since I was in South America. A mare of mine was outside all night, and one of those big bats that they call vampires got her. In the morning, there wasn't enough blood in her to let her stand up. I had to put a bullet through her as she lay there. How long has this been going on?" "About 10 days. 10 days? You're telling me that in 10 days that poor pretty creature has had the blood of 4 men put into her veins?" Then coming close to me, he spoke in a fierce half-whisper. "What took it out?" I shook my head. "That," I said, "is the mystery. Van Helsing is frantic about it, and I can't even begin to guess." When she woke later in the afternoon, Lucy's first movement was to feel in her pocket and pull out the paper which Van Helsing replaced there. Her eyes turned to Van Helsing and then to me too. Then she looked around the room, and seeing where she was, shuddered. She moaned and held her poor thin hands to her pale face. We both understood what she meant, that she had remembered her mother's death. We tried to comfort her, but she seemed very sad, and wept silently and weakly for a long time. We told her that either or both of us would stay with her at all times, and that seemed to comfort her. Toward dusk, she fell asleep, and then a very odd thing happened. As she slept, she took the paper from her pocket and tore it in two. Van Helsing stepped over and took the pieces from her. She went on making tearing movements, as if she still had the paper. Finally, she lifted her hands and opened them, as though scattering the fragments. September 19th. All last night she slept uneasily and seemed weaker and weaker every time she spoke. The professor and I took turns watching, never leaving her for a moment. All night, Quincy patrolled around the house. When the day came, it was clear that the poor girl was losing the battle. She was hardly able to turn her head, and the little food which she ate didn't seem to do her any good. Van Helsing and I both noticed the difference in her, depending on whether she was asleep or awake. When she slept, she looked somehow stronger. Her pale gums must have been pulling away from her teeth, for the teeth looked longer and sharper than usual. When she was awake, she looked more like her sweet self, although a dying self. In the afternoon, she asked for Arthur, and we telegraphed for him. When he arrived, it was nearly 6 o'clock. His presence seemed to cheer her up, and she spoke to him a little. It is now nearly 1 o'clock, and he and Van Helsing are with her.